hundreds of thousands of German soldiers dead in the Soviet Union under Stalin's command. At the end of the Second World War, the brutality of the conflict did not cease on the battlefield, but extended into prisoner camps. Over 2,800,000 German soldiers fell into the hands of the Soviet Union, facing a fate many describe as a slow and merciless execution. The winter of 1945 to 1946 marked the darkest point, with thousands of prisoners succumbing to starvation, disease, and exploitation. Heartbreaking accounts detail 16-hour work shifts in the forests of Siberia or the mines of the Urals, where hunger turned men into animals. To many Soviets, these soldiers symbolized the eternal enemy, bearing responsibility for the horrors perpetrated during the Nazi occupation. Between 356,000 and more than 1 million Germans died in Soviet custody, victims of relentless vengeance. Stalingrad, the Third Reich's defeat at the hands of the Red Army. On the 22nd of June 1941, the day arrived when the German invasion of the Soviet Union altered the course of history. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and German troops were advancing rapidly through Soviet territory. Amid the German invasion, their forces reached the city of Stalingrad, aiming to seize control of the city and secure a decisive victory for the German army. However, after months of intense fighting, Soviet forces managed to encircle the Germans in the city, cutting off their supply and communication lines. In November of 1942, the Soviets launched an offensive near Kalach, which left German soldiers unable to respond effectively. Their already precarious logistical situation deteriorated rapidly. The remaining defenders lost ground and suffered defeats in localized skirmishes, running out of food and supplies. Their survival depended on what could be delivered by air. The extreme cold, snow, and diseases caused by poor sanitation, overcrowding, and malnutrition led to the collapse of the German Sixth Army. The situation for the wounded and sick became tragic, as medical stations were insufficient to treat them all. Many died from infections and injuries that, under normal circumstances, would have been minor. On the 2nd of February 1943, Generals Konstantin Rokossovsky and Nikolai Voronov reported that the German army had been defeated and that military operations in the Stalingrad region had ceased. On that day, 40,000 prisoners were added to the 50,000 captured during the preceding 2 days. Immediately after the surrender, German soldiers took anything they could find to keep warm. Soviet forces organized a prisoner camp in Beketovka, where the captives were gathered. The last Luftwaffe flight over Stalingrad took place on the 3rd of February, when a Heinkel He-111 circled over the city, searching for German soldiers who might have escaped the encirclement, aiming to deliver supplies. However, it found no survivors. After the surrender of the German Sixth Army, approximately 91,000 German soldiers were captured by the Red Army. Due to constant Soviet attacks and unfulfilled promises by Nazi authorities, the prisoners were captured in deplorable conditions. Many were already on the brink of death from starvation, extreme cold, and wounds. Long columns of prisoners were forced to march to nearby villages under the frigid February sun. Following the surrender, the soldiers were disarmed, stripped of their belongings, and made to endure long marches to remote, unknown villages. The prisoners were forced to march hundreds of kilometers under sub-zero temperatures, escorted by countless corpses toward labor camps in Siberia and other distant locations. These marches, carried out without adequate food, clothing, or medical care, resulted in the deaths of thousands of soldiers. Many succumbed to typhus, dysentery, diphtheria, scurvy, tuberculosis, edema, and malaria. Those unable to continue were simply executed in the darkness of the night. It is estimated that only 1/3 of the prisoners captured at Stalingrad survived the first weeks. Many perished on the march, while others died in the camps due to the inhumane conditions they endured. Ultimately, of the 91,000 prisoners, only around 5,000 survived. Frozen massacres, murders and torture in German prisoner camps. In the Soviet Union, conditions in detention centers and forced labor camps were extraordinarily harsh. The gulags, established by the NKVD in the 1930s, continued to house the same prisoners who had been there before the outbreak of war. These included individuals accused of espionage, sabotage, aggravated theft, and especially political prisoners condemned for spreading anti-Soviet propaganda or holding counter-revolutionary ideas. With the German invasion during the summer of 1941, the Soviet Ministry of the Interior established a new directorate responsible for managing labor camps for German prisoners of war and their allies. However, this directorate faced numerous logistical challenges due to a lack of manpower to build camps across Soviet territory. Additionally, the uncertainty of the battlefield made it difficult to determine suitable locations for these camps. During the first year of the invasion, the Red Army was only able to capture and detain a limited number of prisoners. The General Directorate for Prisoner of War and Interne Affairs, created by the Ministry of the Interior, oversaw the creation and operation of these camps. However, resource shortages and ongoing battles hindered the effective establishment and management of the camps, limiting the number of prisoners that could be held during the first year of the invasion. The turning point. After Stalingrad. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the situation changed dramatically. The capture of a large number of German prisoners allowed for the establishment of numerous labor camps, particularly in territory reclaimed by the Red Army during its counter-offensive in the Volga region. Around the Stalingrad area, approximately 40 labor camps were constructed. These Soviet prisoner camps were characterized by food shortages, a lack of medical care, and extreme weather conditions. Thousands of prisoners housed in camps like Beketova and Krasnoarmysk, which held the largest numbers of inmates, had to survive on meager rations consisting of black bread mixed with sawdust, potatoes, and occasionally beets or grains. Beketova, a former school damaged during the battle, lacked adequate facilities for the prisoners. Wood from doors and windows was used as firewood, and prisoners slept huddled together on the floor, seeking warmth amidst the crowd of pale and frost-bitten bodies. Winter temperatures at dawn often dropped below 30 degrees Celsius below zero. Most prisoners suffered from severe illnesses, including diphtheria, muscle atrophy, respiratory diseases, and typhus. Corpses were not buried, and Soviet guards often stripped the dead of valuables before abandoning their bodies to the freezing elements, which preserved them. Cases of cannibalism were reported, and theft was rampant. Guards sometimes found amusement in observing the dehumanization of the German army. Work, death, and brutality prisoners endured forced labor, disease, and harsh treatment from the guards. They were forced to work in mines, factories, and infrastructure projects for over 12 hours daily, regardless of the adverse weather conditions. These tasks were performed with primitive tools under the supervision of guards who frequently resorted to violence. Those who failed to meet work quotas or showed signs of weakness were punished severely. The combination of forced labor, malnutrition, and disease led to extremely high mortality rates. Medical resources in the camps were minimal, and injured or sick prisoners were often left to their fate with little to no treatment. Illnesses that would have been treatable under normal circumstances became death sentences. The lack of medical care and resources created a dire situation for the prisoners. The camp regime was highly strict, and minor infractions were met with harsh penalties. Prisoners faced beatings, solitary confinement, or even summary executions. Soviet guards viewed German prisoners with contempt, blaming them for atrocities committed by the Nazis on Soviet soil. This deep hatred manifested in merciless treatment and a complete lack of compassion for the prisoners, aid and disparities in treatment. By the summer of 1943, the Soviet Union began receiving aid packages from the United States, allowing for the distribution of basic food supplies to some prisoners. However, by that time, only a few thousand prisoners remained alive. The treatment of prisoners varied according to their military rank and influence within the Nazi hierarchy. Enlisted soldiers endured the worst conditions, while officers enjoyed certain privileges. For example, in a former monastery in Yelabuga, east of Kazan, approximately 1,800 prisoners were held. Of these, only one-third survived. In contrast, German generals were treated differently. They faced interrogation but were eventually released. Before their release, however, they were used as propaganda tools by the Soviet regime, displayed as trophies of war. This disparity in treatment reflected the complexity of how prisoners of war were perceived in the Soviet Union. Friedrich Paulus, from German commander to Soviet prisoner. Friedrich Paulus, one of the most prominent generals of the Third Reich, lived a life marked by captivity and suffering in the Soviet Union. His story, from his leadership in the Battle of Stalingrad to his imprisonment and later life, reflects the dramatic shift the Second World War brought to the Eastern Front. As commander of the German Sixth Army, Paulus played a pivotal role in the battle. In November of 1942, as German forces advanced toward the southern part of the city, Paulus found himself at the center of one of the most brutal confrontations of the war. The Soviet resistance, led by General Vasily Chuikov, was relentless. Combined with harsh urban warfare tactics and unforgiving weather, the German forces began to falter. In January of 1943, after weeks of intense combat and a desperate struggle for survival in hostile conditions, Paulus was forced to surrender. Ironically, Paulus had considered Operation Barbarossa a mistake from the start, but felt compelled to follow Hitler's orders out of a sense of military duty. During the campaign, Paulus had advised cutting off the Soviet retreat to prevent their withdrawal into the interior and urged Hitler to provide winter clothing for the soldiers in case the war dragged on. However, Hitler forbade any further mention of the subject, reflecting the tension and conflict between Paulus and the Nazi leadership. On the 30th of January 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, with the implicit suggestion that he should take his own life rather than surrender. Paulus, however, disobeyed. In retaliation, the Gestapo arrested his sons, Ernst Alexander and Friedrich, and sent them to a prison in the Alps, from which they were released in 1945. Meanwhile, Paulus's wife, Elena Rossetti Solescu, faced an uncertain future as Paulus was transported to a Soviet prisoner of war camp in the east, captivity and hardships. The journey into captivity was fraught with difficulties. Paulus and his men suffered from hunger, extreme cold, and exhaustion. Once in the prison camps, they faced even more severe challenges. The Soviet camps for prisoners of war were overcrowded and lacked basic supplies. Food was scarce, facilities were rudimentary, and diseases spread rapidly. For Paulus, captivity was not only a personal ordeal but also a political tool for the Soviet regime. The Soviets saw him as a valuable figure to further their propaganda efforts. As a high-ranking general, Paulus became a symbol of Soviet victory. His capture was used to showcase the superiority of the Red Army and to boost the morale of the Soviet population. In 1943, Paulus was paraded at public events and press conferences designed to humiliate him and project the image of a defeated leader who now denounced the Nazi regime. His appearances at these events were carefully orchestrated to promote Soviet ideology and highlight the enemy's weakness. Release and later life. After nearly a decade in captivity, Paulus was finally released in 1953. Tragically, his wife passed away just 4 years later. Paulus's release coincided with a period of improving relations between the Soviet Union and West Germany, yet his return to Germany was bittersweet. The nation he found was in ruins, grappling with a long and arduous process of reconstruction and redefinition. Returning to a divided Germany, Paulus faced a complicated and ambivalent legacy. His role in the Battle of Stalingrad and his decision to surrender sparked debate and controversy. While some criticized his actions, others saw him as a pragmatic leader who prioritized the lives of his soldiers over blind loyalty to Hitler. After his release, Paulus served as the civilian head of the Institute for Military Historical Research until the end of his life. In his later years, he developed progressive bulbar paralysis, a debilitating condition that ultimately led to his death in a clinic in Dresden on the 1st of February 1957. The partisan women who defeated Nazi terror. After the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, the population of many cities and towns united to resist the invaders. Women played a crucial role in the Soviet partisan movement, seeing it as an opportunity to contribute to their country's defense. Many were drawn to this form of struggle because recruitment offices of the Red Army often denied them the opportunity to join. Among the most remarkable partisans were young women who displayed immense courage and determination in fighting the Nazis. One notable example is Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, an 18-year-old high school student from Moscow who joined a partisan unit in October of 1941. Alongside other partisans, she marched southwest toward Naro-Fominsk, crossing the front line into German-occupied territory. There they carried out sabotage missions, including mining roads and cutting communication lines, aiming to weaken the enemy forces and support Soviet troops. On November 27, 1941, Kozmodemyanskaya received orders to set fire to the village of Petrishchevo, where a German cavalry regiment was stationed. Together with her fellow partisans Boris Krenov and Vasily Klubkov, she successfully burned 3 houses. However, while attempting to set fire to a 4th, she was captured by German forces. Zoya Kozmodemyanskaya, symbol of resistance. After her arrest, Kozmodemyanskaya was brutally treated. She was stripped, beaten, and tortured with 200 lashes. Parts of her body were burned, yet she refused to divulge any information to her captors. The following day, she was taken to the village center with a board around her neck that read, "Arsonist." In the central square, she was publicly hanged, and her body was left on display for all to see. Despite the brutality of her death, Kozmodemyanskaya became a symbol of Soviet resistance against the Nazi invasion. On February 16, 1942, she was posthumously named a hero of the Soviet Union, becoming the first woman to receive this honor during the war, Zinaida Portnova, the youngest hero of the Soviet Union. Although Kozmodemyanskaya was one of the youngest women to be named a hero of the Soviet Union, the youngest recipient of this title was Zinaida Portnova, a courageous fighter who joined the Belarusian resistance in 1942 at just 16 years old. Portnova became a member of a clandestine organization called Young Avengers, distributing Soviet propaganda leaflets in German-occupied Belarus, collecting and hiding weapons for Soviet soldiers, and reporting on German troop movements. After learning to use weapons and explosives from older members of the group, Portnova participated in sabotage missions targeting a gas depot, a local power plant, and a brick factory. These actions were estimated to have killed over 100 German soldiers. In 1943, Portnova worked as a kitchen assistant in Obol, where she poisoned food intended for the Nazi garrison stationed there. When she fell under suspicion, she ate some of the food in front of the Nazis to prove it was not poisoned. Since the effects were not immediate, she was released. Portnova later became violently ill but survived after drinking large amounts of whey. When she did not return to work, the Germans realized she was responsible and began searching for her. In January of 1944, Portnova was captured after months of evasion. Taken to a village called Goriani, she was interrogated by a Gestapo officer. Believing she was harmless, the officer let his guard down, allowing Portnova to seize his pistol and kill him. She also shot 2 German soldiers who entered the room before attempting to flee into the forest. She was eventually caught near a riverbank. Following her recapture, Portnova endured torture before being taken to the forest and executed. She was not yet 18 years old at the time of her death. Despite her tragic end, Portnova was recognized for her bravery and sacrifice. In 1958, she was posthumously named a hero of the Soviet Union. A monument was erected in her honor in Minsk, and several youth pioneer detachments were named after her. Her legacy as one of the youngest and most courageous women of the Soviet resistance remains honored to this day. Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, the German general who betrayed the Third Reich. Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach was born on the 22nd of August, 1888, in Potsdam, Germany, into a family with a long military tradition. In 1908, he joined the German army and served during the First World War, fighting on both fronts as a lieutenant in the Imperial German Army. After the war, he was promoted to captain and continued his military career during the Weimar Republic, holding various positions and gradually rising through the ranks. When the Second World War broke out, Seydlitz-Kurzbach was assigned to command positions on the Eastern Front, participating in key campaigns, including the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. During the Battle of Stalingrad, he commanded the 51st Army Corps, which was part of the German 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus. His unit was involved in some of the fiercest fighting in Stalingrad, but like the rest of the 6th Army, became trapped when the Red Army encircled the city. As the situation for the German forces became increasingly desperate, Seydlitz-Kurzbach found himself at the center of one of the war's most critical battles. Defiance. Against Hitler's strategy. As conditions in Stalingrad worsened, Seydlitz-Kurzbach grew increasingly opposed to Hitler's strategy of holding their position at all costs. He advocated for a strategic withdrawal to avoid the destruction of the Sixth Army, but his suggestions were dismissed by Paulus, who adhered to Hitler's orders. Seydlitz-Kurzbach's discontent with the decision to forbid a retreat became evident, and he openly criticized Hitler's strategy. On the 30th of January 1943, shortly before the surrender of the Sixth Army, Hitler promoted Seydlitz-Kurzbach to Field Marshal. This promotion carried an implicit expectation that he would take his own life rather than face capture. Seydlitz-Kurzbach, however, disobeyed this unspoken order and was subsequently captured by the Soviets, becoming one of the highest-ranking German officers to fall into enemy hands. Collaboration with the Soviets. After his capture, Seydlitz-Kurzbach made the unusual decision to collaborate with the Soviets. Under Stalin's orders, the Red Army's High Command tasked him with attempting to persuade other German generals to join a plot to overthrow Hitler. Among those who agreed to collaborate were Helmut Schlummer, Moritz von Dreber, and Alexander Edler von Daniels. Seydlitz-Kurzbach participated in radio broadcasts from Moscow, sending anti-Nazi messages to German troops. This collaboration led to his citizenship being revoked and a death sentence being issued against him in absentia by a Nazi military tribunal. His family also suffered repercussions, with several members removed from official positions. In September of 1943, Seydlitz-Kurzbach was appointed president of the League of German Officers, a group of captured officers in the Soviet Union committed to opposing Hitler. This group operated under the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-backed propaganda organization led by communist writer Erich Wienert. Seydlitz-Kurzbach even proposed creating an armed force of prisoner soldiers to launch a communist guerrilla campaign in Germany. However, Stalin distrusted the idea of rearming German prisoners, and the plan was never implemented. Downfall and imprisonment. Following the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July of 1944, Soviet intelligence concluded that Seydlitz-Kurzbach's propaganda efforts had been ineffective. Stalin ordered the dissolution of the League of German Officers, and Seydlitz-Kurzbach, along with his collaborators, was re-imprisoned. After the war ended in 1945, Seydlitz-Kurzbach refused to cooperate with the Soviet occupation of Germany. He was tried and convicted of war crimes despite not being a communist. The Soviets attempted to recruit him to their party, but he declined, stating that his sole objective had been to end the war to save Germany. In 1950, Seydlitz-Kurzbach was sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted. After spending 14 years in captivity, he was released in 1956, returned to West Germany and legacy. Upon returning to West Germany, Seydlitz-Kurzbach sought to reclaim his properties, military rank, and pension. He succeeded only in overturning the convictions imposed on him by the Third Reich. Unlike many other generals, he did not publish memoirs and was largely shunned by his former comrades in arms. He died in Bremen on the 28th of April, 1976, after a life marked by controversy and rejection. However, in 1994, his descendants successfully petitioned Russian courts to annul the convictions imposed on him by the Soviet Union, granting a degree of posthumous rehabilitation. German women in the collapse of the Third Reich: capture, punishment, and repatriation. At the outbreak of war in 1939, approximately 140,000 women were associated with the German armed forces. Of these, 50,000 worked in administrative roles, and 90,000 served as auxiliaries. As the war progressed, the number of women involved in the military increased significantly, reaching 300,000 by 1944. Under military law, their roles steadily expanded, placing them not only within Germany, but also in occupied territories such as the General Government, Belarus, the Baltic States, occupied France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Among these women, approximately 8,000 worked in communications, while 12,500 were attached to the army in the field. Additionally, nearly 130,000 women served in the Luftwaffe, primarily in administrative and auxiliary roles, although more were assigned to operate anti-aircraft batteries as the war continued. Women in the front lines and their capture. Initially, it was rare to find German women on the front lines, let alone captured as prisoners. However, as the regime's situation grew increasingly desperate, women were armed for self-defense. In the final days of the war, Hitler reversed his earlier stance on the militarization of women, authorizing the creation of an armed women's battalion to bolster male morale. A significant number of women from the German Red Cross also worked alongside the armed forces and were ostensibly protected under the Geneva Convention. German policy generally sought to avoid the capture of women serving in the armed forces. Local commanders were held personally responsible for their safety in cases of immediate danger. On September 30, 1944, orders were issued to evacuate all women under the age of 21 from occupied territories after some female units were captured by Soviet forces in Romania. This gradual withdrawal policy conflicted with the growing need for their skills and heavier workloads to free more men for frontline duty. Women captured by the Allies at the war's end were treated similarly to their male counterparts. Over 100 women were detained at barracks in northern Pilsen, where they formed a choir known as the Pilsen Sparrows and sang for their captors. Initially under American control, Pilsen was later handed over to the Soviets, creating urgency to address the issue of female prisoners. Most were released, but after evaluations, a communications assistant was detained upon identification as a member of the SS. Fear of returning home and post-war repatriation. Many women were unwilling to return to their homes in the Soviet occupation zone, fearing what might happen upon their return. There are no clear records of when these women were eventually released and repatriated, though it is assumed that all had left the camps by the end of 1948. In Soviet prisoner of war internment camps, it was common for women to have their heads shaved, and some were imprisoned. Approximately 200 women were martyred in the final days of the war, likely tortured to death to extract confessions about their involvement in German war crimes. Post-liberation challenges and revenge. The women who were freed faced bleak futures. Some were caught in the widespread and often lethal reprisals carried out against former Nazis in the immediate aftermath of the Third Reich's collapse. Hatred against Germans, especially among Soviet citizens recalling the cruelties inflicted on Leningrad and other areas, led to violent acts of vengeance. Soviet authorities frequently turned a blind eye as these women were attacked, stoned, or beaten to death by enraged Russian citizens. Babi Yar on trial, the Kyiv proceedings. Ukraine, invaded by German forces during 1941, endured brutal repression, including mass civilian murders, the persecution of Jews, and the forced labor of prisoners of war and civilians. Just 10 days after the occupation of Kyiv, the Einsatzgruppen death squads, led by General Otto Rasch with support from the SS and local collaborators, carried out some of the war's most horrific massacres at the Babi Yar ravine on the city's outskirts. Using explosions that destroyed the German headquarters in central Kyiv as a pretext, German forces began systematically exterminating the city's Jewish population. With the cooperation of Ukrainian police and nationalist groups, Jewish residents were rounded up and marched to the Babi Yar ravines near a psychiatric hospital and prison. There, victims were forced to dig their own graves before being executed. Prior to the executions, the SS evacuated the hospital and murdered all its patients. The Babi Yar massacre became one of the war's most tragic episodes, with more than 30,000 Jews murdered in just 2 days. Between September 29th and 30th of 1941, German forces carried out the massacre, killing over 33,000 Ukrainian Jews in 48 hours. A site of mass murder for all the tragedy of Babi Yar did not end with the Jewish massacre. By late 1941, as relations between the Third Reich and certain Ukrainian nationalist groups soured, the Germans captured and executed 600 of their former allies in the same ravine. Thus, Babi Yar became a common grave for both victims and perpetrators. Later, as relations between the Nazis and nationalist groups were restored, the ravine continued to serve as a site for mass executions. Thousands of Jews, Romani people, Soviet prisoners of war, and civilians opposing the Nazi regime were killed there. Beyond the massacres, the Nazis enforced a regime of forced labor, enslaving millions of Ukrainians, including prisoners of war, under inhumane conditions. Reprisals against Ukrainian resistance and acts of sabotage were equally brutal, with hundreds of villages and towns destroyed in retaliation. Erasing evidence. In the summer of 1943, as Soviet forces neared Kyiv, the Germans launched an operation to conceal evidence of their crimes. Surviving prisoners were forced to exhume the corpses from Babi Yar's mass graves and burn them. Once this gruesome task was completed, the Nazis executed the prisoners who had participated in the cover-up. While the exact death toll remains uncertain, estimates suggest that between 100,000 and 200,000 people were murdered at Babi Yar. Paul Blobel, the SS officer responsible for these atrocities, was sentenced to death during the Nuremberg trials and executed at Landsberg prison in June of 1951. This was the same prison where Adolf Hitler had been incarcerated following his failed Munich putsch, during which he wrote Mein Kampf. Otto Rasch, another officer implicated in the crimes, was also charged but died in prison in late 1948 due to health issues. Post-liberation trials in Kiev. After the Red Army liberated Ukraine, Soviet authorities held trials to prosecute local collaborators and Nazi officials responsible for war crimes. Defendants faced charges similar to those at Nuremberg, including the execution of civilians, forced labor exploitation, and other atrocities. Local collaborators who had assisted the Nazis in persecutions were also tried and punished for their actions. One of the most notable trials took place at the Kyiv State Theatre, a venue chosen to emphasize the gravity of the crimes. Soviet prosecutors presented evidence gathered after Ukraine's liberation in 1944, including intelligence reports, survivor testimonies, and physical evidence from massacre sites and forced labor camps. 15 Nazis were ultimately convicted for their roles in the Babi Yar atrocities of September 29th and 30th, 1941. Of these, 12 were sentenced to death and publicly executed in Kyiv's Central Square on January 29, 1946. These executions were filmed and preserved as archival material, later used in Ukrainian filmmaker Sergei Loznitsa's documentary The Trial, released in 2022. Justice eludes many. Despite these trials, most direct perpetrators, both German and Ukrainian, who participated in the Babi Yar massacres, were never brought to justice. This lack of accountability highlights the enduring challenges of addressing the full scope of the atrocities committed during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine. Stalin's revenge, harrowing justice against Germans after the war. The destruction caused by the Nazis in the Soviet Union was so immense that reconstruction was expected to take decades. Stalin repeatedly declared that once the war ended, prisoners from all enemy states, regardless of nationality, could expect prolonged periods of forced labor. This plan had been publicly announced in Moscow over the previous 2 years. At the Tehran Conference in late 1943, Stalin spoke of needing 4 million forced laborers for many years as part of war reparations. By the summer of 1944, this demand had increased to 5 million workers over a 10-year period, which Stalin reiterated in subsequent meetings with the Allied powers. On December 16, 1944, a general order was issued stating that all German men aged 17 to 45 and all women aged 18 to 30 in liberated southeastern Europe who were capable of working were to be transported to the Soviet Union. Within 2 months, approximately 110,000 individuals had already been identified and transported. Another 100,000 joined them from occupied Germany in the early months of 1945. The forced relocation and exploitation of prisoners, German prisoners of war held by the Soviets, were also transported to the Soviet Union, with the exception of about 100,000 deemed exempt due to age, illness, or youth. The remaining prisoners were concentrated in around 60 camps in Poland and eastern Germany before being transported to the Soviet Union, a process completed by the end of October 1945. Prisoners were also sent to specific locations in other territories under Soviet control that housed critical natural resources, such as Jakimov in Czechoslovakia, where they were tasked with mining uranium for Stalin's nuclear program. Initially, Stalin claimed the prisoners would be held as long as necessary for reconstruction, which he estimated would take 15 years. However, most Axis prisoners were released by the Soviet Union between May 1945 and the end of 1949, though this still far exceeded the detention periods of most Allied powers. The majority of those released were elderly, ill, or otherwise unable to work. On June 6, 1945, it was decreed that any future releases or repatriations required Politburo approval based on a set of criteria. By this time, the Soviet secret police had compiled a list of approximately 225,000 German and Austrian soldiers in camps and hospitals deemed unfit for work. This list, however, excluded officers who were to remain in captivity. In August of that year, a total of 708,055 prisoners, including 412,000 Germans, were identified for release due to their inability to work. Fate of remaining prisoners. What became of the remaining prisoners? Soviet authorities were keen to release those deemed economically unproductive, but wished to prevent the release of individuals suspected of harboring anti-Soviet views. Such individuals were held under various pretexts. To maximize the labor potential of prisoners, Sergei Kruglov, head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, proposed sending home 150,000 men unfit for work and increasing the rations of the remaining prisoners by 10% to boost productivity. German accounts of captivity in the Soviet Union reflect the widespread culture of hunger that pervaded the 2,500 camps. This scarcity mirrored the plight of nearby civilian populations, as the country's productive capacity had been devastated during the war. These accounts describe rampant dysentery among prisoners, hoarding of food, and adherence to food taboos even in the face of starvation. They also recount theft and trade of food within the camps and the slow, listless movements of prisoners in their daily activities. Desperate acts of self-mutilation. Desperation was evident in the lengths some prisoners went to in order to be declared unfit for work and sent home. Self-mutilation became a grim reality once it was understood that the unfit were being repatriated. Reports surfaced of men amputating their fingers or deliberately injuring their eyes to induce blindness. Others resorted to subtler methods, such as consuming large quantities of salt to cause edema. Some succeeded in being repatriated as a result, but others lost their lives in the process. The painful end of the war and the high price of Soviet revenge. After the Battle of Stalingrad, tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured and subjected to inhumane conditions in Soviet labor camps. These soldiers faced extreme cold, severe hunger, and the constant threat of violence or execution by their captors. The logistics of the death marches seemed designed to break the prisoners' will, with brutal conditions, lack of supplies, and physical exhaustion, resulting in high mortality rates. Many lives were lost before even reaching their uncertain destinations. Those who survived the marches faced equally harsh conditions in Soviet labor camps, marked by chronic malnutrition, endemic diseases, and grueling physical labor. The ordeal of German officers' figures such as Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commander of the 6th Army Corps, and Karl Strecker, general of the 11th Army Corps, exemplify the hardships faced by German officers in captivity. Seydlitz-Kurzbach distinguished himself through his resilience during the Battle of Stalingrad and his subsequent capture, while Strecker endured the same extreme conditions as other prisoners in the labor camps. The Kyiv Trial, the Nuremberg of Kyiv. The Kyiv Trial, often called the Nuremberg of Kyiv, was a significant effort by the Soviet Union to deliver justice to the victims of Nazi crimes. This process included high-ranking officers responsible for atrocities such as the Babi Yar massacre. The trial aimed not only to punish the guilty but also to serve as a propaganda tool, reinforcing the Soviet narrative of resistance and justice. Repatriation and its challenges. The repatriation of German prisoners of war to their homeland after years of captivity marked a bittersweet conclusion. They returned to a Germany devastated by war, deeply transformed and struggling with displacement, poverty, and reconstruction. These returning soldiers faced physical and psychological scars and the difficult task of reintegrating into a society vastly different from the one they had left. For many, the return represented a moment of reconciliation with their past and with the emerging new order in Europe. The turning point of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad, considered the bloodiest in history, was a turning point in World War II. The German army's defeat signaled the beginning of the decline of its military power on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht suffered significant losses in both manpower and equipment. The lack of resources and the violence of the war caused a humanitarian crisis in Germany, displacing thousands of people who struggled to access food, water, or shelter. The defeat at Stalingrad severely weakened German logistics and marked the limits of their eastward advance. The surrender of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the first in German military history, plunged Hitler into a deep depression. The losses at Stalingrad, both human and material, hastened the collapse of the Third Reich, which culminated in the fall of Berlin in 1945. A somber reminder. The story of German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union serves as a grim reminder of the brutality and extreme suffering that characterized World War II. It also stands as a testament to the importance of remembering and learning from history to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.